joining us from. I know we're probably going to have a few more people joining us in the next minute or two because we had a lot more people signed up than what's currently joined, but we're going to go ahead and get started because we have a lot of material to cover. Thank you for joining us for our Using the NIST Privacy Framework as a Blueprint to Your Privacy program. We do have a few housekeeping items that I want to go through, so if you'll bear with me for a moment. We have taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your computer desktop in the upper right corner. If you're listening using your computer speaker system, that would be by the default setting. If you prefer to join over the phone, just please select the telephone option and then dial in following the directions there. Next slide, please. If you have an opportunity to submit text questions to the presenters today, you can type that in the questions pane on the control panel. We will be looking at questions throughout and trying to answer them as we go, but we're also going to try to save time at the end for any questions. If you have to send you can send them anytime during the presentation, and as I said, we'll try to answer them as we go along, and what we don't get to, we will respond to at the end of the presentation. So with that, let's get started. So as we talked about this, we want to talk about the privacy framework as a blueprint to your privacy program, and thinking about how to adopt the privacy framework, how to stay ahead of the curve, and how to build some resilience into your privacy program. Next slide. As always, we issue the disclaimer. I am an attorney, so I always make sure everyone understands the presentation is for general informational purposes. Nothing in the presentation is intended as legal advice, and the opinions my colleague and I express are our opinions and not necessarily those of our organization. Next slide, please. So with that, I'll introduce myself. Some of you on the phone may know me. I'm Marti Arvin. I'm VP of Privacy and Compliance Services here at Synergistic. I've been with the company about 5.5 years now. Prior to joining Synergistic, I spent over 18 years in-house as a Chief Compliance and Privacy Officer. I've served as an expert witness, and I think I'm up to about 13 cases now. And I look forward to discussing this topic with you. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Bertrand, to introduce herself.
Thanks, Marti. I'm Bertrand. I'm a Senior Privacy and Compliance Consultant here at Synergistic. I've been with the company for almost 4 years now. Prior to my work here at Synergistic, I was a HIPAA Privacy Officer for 5 years at a hospital system. And I spent another 5 years as a Privacy Officer at a lab and pharmacy system. With that, we're going to start into a couple of our learning objectives today. As Marti mentioned, we're going to go through and provide you with a little information about the NIST Privacy Framework. We're going to talk through privacy by design and how you might consider privacy as you're building your systems and processes around data. And then we're going to close out the presentation by talking about the Cobot maturity model and how to use that alongside the NIST Privacy Framework. So our agenda for the NIST Privacy Framework, we're going to talk through a brief history. We'll provide you with some of the key components of the framework, and then we're going to talk to you about how you might use the privacy framework to assess your existing privacy program, but also as a building block if you have not yet implemented a privacy program. And before we provide you with this information, we have a poll here for you. How many of you were aware of the NIST Privacy Framework before today? And if you could respond with yes, no, or somewhat in the chat.
And if you want to just go ahead and respond, Katie's going to move on, and then I'll kind of just brief her on what we're seeing in the responses as far as your awareness of the framework. Thank you.
Thanks, Marti. So to provide you with a little bit of background on the NIST Privacy Framework, the framework was developed similarly to the cybersecurity framework, if you're familiar with that. It was initiated by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology. It has a similar look to the cybersecurity framework. And if you weren't already aware of this, I have some good news for you. It's voluntary. There's absolutely, at this point in time, no regulatory or statutory requirement to implement the NIST Privacy Framework. But as I said previously, I'm hoping that we can provide you with some information or some food for thought as to why you might want to. NIST collaborated with industry professionals across industries, healthcare, finance, you name it, put a call out to the public to participate in the development of this framework. And they discussed, how the privacy principles around data and personally identifiable information. And as I previously mentioned, it aligns with the cybersecurity framework. So to provide you with some of the key components or how the NIST Privacy Framework is structured, it starts with 5 functions. And as you can see here on this slide, those functions are very broad topics. Not a lot of detail in the identified functions. The functions break down into categories. The categories provide you with a little bit more descriptors on what is intended by each of the functions. And then it's broken down even further into 100 different subcategories. The subcategories provide you with quite a bit of detail on how, tasks, if you will, on how to accomplish the functions. Some detail around the functions here. The first function we have is identify. Here you're looking to identify your data. Where is the data? What type of data do I have? And if you think about, how many systems you might have that has data, you would want to think about the inventory of each system and the type of data that's on those systems. The next function we have here is governing. And the intent here is to build some governance structure around your data. That might include policies around the governance, and also how you're going to manage risk, who's responsible for the data. And the next function we have is controls, where you have personally identifiable information. Of course, you want to have controls around what you're collecting and how you're processing that data. And the fourth function, communicate. Of course, you're going to want to communicate internally to your workforce members, your employees, on what their responsibilities around the personally identifiable information. But there's also a component here to communicate with the public as well around your responsibilities for their data. And the last function, of course, where you have data, you want to implement some sort of security or safeguard structure around that data.
And when you think about this, many privacy programs we see in healthcare tend to be focused explicitly on HIPAA. And as Katie will discuss a little further, this structure is really thinking about all the data you collect, because the various state breach notification laws implicate different types of data. So you may have obligations that are beyond HIPAA, and it's really going to be important to fully understand what kind of sensitive, individually identifiable information you might hold. And that's where the structuring your program around the privacy framework might help you get better control over that than thinking solely about the explicit regulatory environment like HIPAA, Gramm-Leach-Bliley, or something like that.
Exactly right, Marty. And we'll, as you mentioned, we'll talk about that in a little bit, a few more slides. More detail. So as we mentioned in a couple of slides ago, each of the functions are broken down into categories. And so you can see here by way of example, the identify is a very broad topic. It breaks down further into inventory and mapping. So it provides you with a little bit more detail about the expectation here. And you can see here as well, similar to the cybersecurity framework, each of the functions and categories and subcategories are coded. So ID meaning identify, IM, inventory and mapping, and the P, of course, means it's the privacy framework. And here you can see an example of the subcategories. In our example here, identify the function, the category for inventory and mapping, and you can see two of the subcategories, the tasks that you might complete to implement this particular function. And from a coding perspective, you see each of the subcategories are numbered. And in this last section, this last slide of this section, we want to talk a little bit about why you might implement a voluntary framework, or why you might use the framework to compare against whatever existing privacy program you have in place. And so we'll start with why would I implement a voluntary framework? I have enough work to do. I don't need additional work. But I think that using the NIST Privacy Framework as a building block for a privacy program is a great way to start. If you haven't already implemented a privacy program, it's a great place to start. It's very broad, it's very flexible. And I would point out too that as more and more states start to pass legislation around data and data protections and privacy for that data, implementing this framework on a voluntary basis and getting a head start on that, you may already find yourself, if you find yourself in a state that implements such legislation, you're going to find yourself already on the way to compliance. So, in this last year, earlier this year, we had more than 30 states try to pass a data protection legislation. 2 states did, Colorado and Virginia. So now we have 3 states, California, Colorado, and Virginia, with data privacy protection laws. And I have to speculate that that trend will continue as we move into the future. More and more states will start to look at this. In addition to that, the federal government, I believe, I'm in the camp of, at some point, the federal government is probably going to implement some sort of data privacy legislation. And so using this framework as a building block to start on that data privacy protection road is a great place to start, and you're going to find yourself in a pretty good compliance position. Now, for those of you that already have some sort of data privacy protection requirements, for example, if you're a HIPAA covered entity, you've probably already implemented a privacy program to meet the requirements of that regulation. You're going to find that the NIST privacy rule, the NIST privacy framework, provides you with some great way to look at what you already have in place, but also provides you with additional privacy concepts that you may not have thought of to strengthen and further build your privacy program. For example, the NIST privacy framework has a notice requirement to it. It's very general, broad requirement to provide notice to your public around your data collection and processing, whereas the HIPAA privacy rule has very specific requirements for the notice. So there's a similarity there. But if you think about in the previous slides, our example for the function to identify your data and map it and inventory it, that's not something that's expressly required by the HIPAA privacy rule. So that's an example of where if you use the NIST privacy framework as an assessment tool, that's something that might strengthen your existing privacy program.
And Katie, I think what you just said is so important because that's where we've seen issues with clients. That's where I've seen issues in organizations I've worked with. Knowing your data, knowing what data you have, why you have it, how you're retaining it is critical. And I can't tell you the number of entities that I've spoken with that have had data compromises, and they're astonished when they start to do the deeper dive and realize all the data they've got, and then also try to identify where some of it might be, why it ever got there. And implementing something like the framework, I think, will give you better control around that. It is not an easy task. So we're not here to say you can just snap your fingers and put this in place. But in my opinion, the work will be well worth it, because you will have a better understanding of what your data is, again, why you have it, why you're retaining it, whether you actually need to retain it. And that's likely going to allow you to minimize the amount of data you have, which will then help reduce your risk if and when a data compromise occurs. And you'll just be able to get a better sense and perhaps also create solutions that will run you across compliance obligations under a number of regulations. So I think there are significant benefits to doing a more holistic privacy program and not being as focused on specific regulatory obligations as it relates to your privacy program.
Exactly right, Marty. I absolutely, it's my favorite part of this framework is the idea that we're looking at data in a more holistic way. And I think from an organizational perspective too, being able to say, you know, because data is so prevalent and you know, if you will, the new oil of the 21st century, that being able to say to your consumers, you know, we understand the risk to your data and we have implemented, you know, controls around that data. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Marty to talk to us about data governance and privacy by design, and to finish up with telling us about the Cobot maturity model.
Thanks, Katie. So when you think about governance and privacy by design, it's not exactly the same as the framework model we've just been talking about, but it's really started with the intent that as you're developing technology predominantly, you think about the privacy implications at the beginning as you're designing it, and structure the technology so that it takes into account those privacy considerations. Now it's broadened out to really thinking about any technology, process, practice you engage in, to think about privacy at the beginning and weave that into the construct. So I'm going to do a brief overview of privacy by design, talk about the principles of it, and then the considerations of privacy by design and data governance. So next slide, Katie. So the principles of privacy by design, if you're familiar with standard privacy principles, these are pretty common. It's a proactive, not a reactive, or a preventative, not remedial way of approaching it. It says privacy is a default setting. In other words, we're going to make it private and think about why we would make it less private, rather than just put it together and have that privacy be a consideration at the end. It is embedded in the design of the process, practice, technology, whatever it is you're looking at. It has full functionality, and it's a positive sum game, meaning you're designing this to, you know, ensure as much privacy as possible, not a zero sum game. And again, it's thinking about full end-to-end security around the information and the privacy of the information. It's a full life cycle of protection, from the moment you start to think about acquiring the data, to acquiring it, to retaining it, to deleting it, to sharing it. That whole construct of the life cycle, you're thinking about the privacy implications. And then the visibility and transparency of the construct of you're keeping it open. You're helping as Katie mentioned, under the privacy framework, you're ensuring that you're transparent about how you're collecting, using, sharing, disclosing information. And again, you're being respectful of the user's privacy. So it's user-centric. It's not based as much on what's best for the organization, but what's best for the organization as well as what's best for that end user, consumer, client, whomever it might be. Next slide. So we have a quick question here. We didn't see any answers to our first question, so please provide your answers in the chat. You know, we're interested in sort of where you are on this. Are you thinking about privacy before implementing a new system or process? How many people know that, every time it's yes, every time it's no or not, or somewhat, sometimes we know we do, but we're not quite sure if we do always. So again, please type your responses in the chat. Katie, would you go to the next slide, please? So thinking about the principles of privacy by design and being proactive, not reactive, you have to understand your risk environment. And this, again, ties back to what Katie talked about in the privacy framework. If you don't understand your data and the implications and your obligations, you're not going to understand your risk environment. Anticipate likely scenarios. Try to think through what do we need, what do we have to do, what could happen here, so that you're trying to be responsive to those as you design rather than when something happens. And the next one is a little more aligned with how the EU thinks about privacy rather than how we tend to think about privacy in the US. And that is, it's a right, not a regulatory obligation. In other words, I, as an individual, have an inherent right to privacy. And if you're going to get my data, then you need to be respectful of that and monitor that and track that. Again, in the US, we tend to think of privacy based on the nature of the data, rather than as a more of a right of the individual versus a regulatory obligation based on the nature of the data. And privacy is at the forefront of business decisions and strategies. So when people are thinking about what you do as an organization, you're thinking as part of that about the privacy of the information. Next slide.
Marty, before we move to the next slide, would you say, I love the privacy is a right, not a regulatory obligation. And in listening to you speak about that, it seems to me that from the U.S. perspective, it seems that the biggest shift, I think, for us is going to be thinking about privacy at the front versus this is the greatest and latest whatever machine, and we aren't really thinking about what data is going to be collected or stored on that machine. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, again, I think as people get more and more sensitive about what data is being collected about them, and we see the state laws that you mentioned being passed, and things of that nature. I think this is going to be forced upon us, but it's quite honestly, it's a good business thought process to think about that, because again, if you just allow people to collect tons and tons of data, and in today's environment and the technology solutions we have, you can keep data for a long time and store it and not have much cost at all as far as actual monetary cost of storing that data. The monetary cost obviously may be that if you have a data compromise and you have all sorts of data that you don't really need, that you shouldn't really have, that maybe is in violation of your own data retention and destruction policies, that's where it's going to get more problematic for you, and you're going to increase your risk. So I think being cognizant of that's going to be very important. Can you go to the next slide, please? And I apologize, apparently questions, the answers are coming in, but I am not seeing them in the Q&A, so I apologize for that. So I mentioned privacy as a default setting. So again, it's protection of sensitive data is a standard setting. And if you think about healthcare and HIPAA, I think most of us have that as the approach that we tend to take. But when we talk about other types of data, that may not be as true. And again, in healthcare, we often find the privacy officer has oversight for the HIPAA obligations, but the obligations under other regulatory schemes may be in other pockets of the organization. And I think, again, when you think about privacy by design and setting that up as your organizational thought process, then it will force you to think about where that data is and who's responsible for it and who your data steward is. And also thinking about using the privacy framework, it will allow you to, I think, blend that across different areas of responsibility if the privacy officer isn't responsible for all sensitive data. And again, you should set it up so that the consumer or the customer doesn't have to take action to help ensure that they're protecting their privacy. Now, you might all be aware that you'll get opt-out provisions or opt-in provisions on websites now. You have the option of telling people not to sell your data now. Ideally, that wouldn't be something the consumer would have to take action on if you're thinking about privacy by design, but we're not quite there yet. And again, it's that privacy protection is built into the systems and practices of the organization. Next slide, please. Again, privacy is embedded to the design. It's not an afterthought. And I analogize this to when I think you know you've got a successful compliance program. And to me, that's when people are reaching out to you and saying, hey, we've got this new thing we want to do. We'd like you to have a seat at the table so we can ensure that as we evolve it, we're thinking about compliance rather than, you know, I've had so many instances in my career where someone comes to me on a Thursday and says, hey, Marty, can you take a look at this? We're going to go live on Monday. You know, just give us your compliance blessing. And I'm betting there's others on the phone who've had similar experiences where you said they want you to give the blessing and you start to look at it and you're like, well, I can't. There are problems with this, or there's significant risk associated with this. And I want to make sure everybody's aware what the risk is before I give my blessing, because I'm highly concerned. And if you get brought in at the beginning and help them structure it in a compliant way, or help them structure it so that privacy is being thought about, then you end up with a better product, less risk for the organization, and you know, it's just a positive overall. And again, it doesn't diminish functionality. That's, you know, obviously for all of us, we have to think about our operational teams and have to make sure that as we put in place these processes, it doesn't so slow down the business or so hamper the business that we can't function as a business. So that has to be a trade-off and a balance that you try to reach there. And again, those fair information practices are considered at every stage of the development or the evolution of the process. Next slide. Again, the full functionality, positive sum game, not zero sum. Privacy by design should be a win-win, meaning I as a consumer am comfortable in that my data is being protected, but you as an organization are also comfortable that you have the ability to utilize the data in a meaningful way for you. And so it really has to, you know, should be set up and thought of in that context. Privacy and security needs to be balanced with each other and not competing against each other. You know, sometimes when I've spoken with information security officers, they want to set up a construct that it makes the data very, very secure. But when you think about how the operational team is going to utilize it and that end user, you look at it and say, well, that's great that the data is so secure, but it's no longer functional for us. And so thinking about how you let those two be symbiotic and complement each other rather than compete against each other. And then again, the solutions can be multifunctional. They can be solutions that can help you meet multiple goals. It doesn't have to be just the privacy. And if you think about this and think about Katie's comments on the framework, you look at this and say, okay, if we're really thinking about the data we have and how to protect it and thinking about privacy as we evolve this, then we're going to reduce our risks generally, because we're going to have probably better relationships with our consumers and customers. And so again, it's going to be multifunctional to do this and think about it. Again, all legitimate business interests are considered. So you really have to think about the entire context. You can't, you know, go in with blinders on. I think that's where I see, you know, problems when someone goes in with blinders on and they think this is the way it has to be done and this is, you know, my way or the highway type of approach. You really have to sit at the table and have all the different individuals involved contributing and thinking about this and considering this and thinking about a solution that's going to, again, be that right balance of maximizing privacy but minimizing burden on the end user. So it's, you know, those are some of the things you have to consider. And you know, you don't have to compromise the business functionality in order to meet your commitment for privacy. Next slide. And then again, the end-to-end security. Data has to be appropriately secured based on the level of sensitivity. We see more and more organizations creating some sort of sensitivity grid or data grid that describes different types of data that they hold. So you may have what some call general data, which is data that's, can freely flow to any third party and flow within the organization. You may have confidential data, which is, maybe business proprietary information, maybe, some limited information about the consumer or client or your patient. And then you have the sensitive data, which is going to be things like protected health information under HIPAA, or, perhaps HR data when you think about that of your employees. But, again, thinking through how do you classify that type of information, and it's going to often be based on the sensitivity. So if you don't have anything defined on what the sensitivity levels are, this will be more difficult to do. And again, it has to be considered throughout the entire life cycle of the data. And this is, I've said this several times, and you're probably going to hear me repeat it again. How is it being collected? Is it being collected in a secure way to maintain privacy? If you're not even collecting it in a secure way to maintain privacy, that's obviously problematic. Where is it being maintained? Who can have access to that information? And this is where, your role-based access for different systems, including your EHR, your HR system, and all of those, is going to be so important to think through. Not everybody should have full access to everything in your organization. And I know many of you are fully aware of that and have good role-based access in your organizations. And not only who can access it, but actually how is it being accessed? Particularly in the remote work environment that we have post-COVID or during COVID, and more so post-COVID, because I hear more and more organizations where they're going to allow workers who pre-COVID would have come to the office to stay remote work post-COVID, even though there's not the COVID reason to stay remote. They found that workforce tend to like it. I've even heard a couple people say they tend to find their workforce is more productive. But if I'm accessing it through my home computer, how secure is that computer? So these are things you have to think about on that end-to-end security. Is it appropriate to share with third parties? There's going to be data that is, there's going to be data that isn't. There may be a group of data that some of it you can share with third parties and some of it you can't. And again, that's going to be important to understand that and understand how it is being shared and what controls you have in place on how it's shared with others. And is it actually being destroyed when it's no longer needed? As I mentioned previously, it's so easy to store data now. And, I've said in other presentations I've done, I think it's a 132 gig thumb drive that literally is the size of my thumbnail. So it's more compact, more capacity, and so that just makes it easier for us to keep the data and not think about destroying it. And that's really something that should be a strong consideration, so that you're not retaining data that it puts, exposes you should it be compromised. So next slide, Katie. And again, the visibility and transparency principle, it supports the development of that trust with that end user, with the individual whose data you're collecting, and also with users of the system or the practice. If they know what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to do it, they're going to be more likely to maintain the privacy of the information, and you're going to increase confidence with that end user that you're an organization that takes this seriously. And it also aligns with the fair information practices, but particularly with those practices around accountability, openness, and compliance. So, thinking through and considering ensuring that the end user or the party whose data you're collecting knows what you're doing with it, and it's clear to them and they know what the expectations are. Next slide. And then finally, the respect for the end user and keeping it user-centric. It allows subjects that, the individual whose data you're collecting to play a more active role in managing their data. And again, goes back to those fair information practices, that practice of consent. We've all heard the stories about platforms like Facebook and others that you log into it and you may not realize the data they're collecting about you simply because you've logged into the system and how they're actually using that data. And so that's why you see some of the GDPR directives that you have to get consent. You're seeing a little bit more of that around the state laws that are being passed. Last I looked, Katie mentioned there were 2 states that passed laws this year. There are 5 additional states as of about 2 months ago that had active legislation going through their legislatures. I'm not as optimistic as Katie about how soon we will have a federal privacy law, if ever. The 2 big dispute points there are breach notification and the opt-in, opt-out. So fingers crossed, we might see something. I think as more states pass privacy laws, you have an increased likelihood of a federal law just because businesses are going to lobby to have one federal law rather than have to worry about complying with multiple different state laws that all have slightly varied obligations that cover slightly varied data and et cetera. And again, thinking about the accuracy, help ensure that the data is actually accurate, complete, and up to date. And this really is more and more practices of giving the consumer the right to look at the data you hold about them and correct it. We all know that for HIPAA, I have the right to have my record amended if I believe the data there is wrong. But this is really putting that out as a general fair information practice rather than an explicit regulatory obligation. And again, individuals should be able to readily access the personal information that's collected about them, be informed on how it's being used and disclosed, challenge that accuracy, and make appropriate corrections or amendments if the data is erroneous. Now, I think this could be a little complex because consumers may argue the data is erroneous, and when you look at it, you're like, well, we don't believe it is. But you need to, again, just have a thought process around how you would handle that. And then individuals should be able to complain when they feel like that there's misuses of their data and information, and you should have a method to respond to that. So again, this thinking about it in the construct of a more holistic approach rather than specific regulatory obligations. And again, thinking about those interactions with the user and how you can make any interactions with users very user-friendly. I will tell you that I've recently, my husband recently wanted to acquire his health records from an organization. And so he collected their form and brought it home, and I reviewed it. And the form actually explicitly says, if you want us to share, to give you a copy of your information, now this is PHI, you must sign an authorization. Now, I hope we all know that HIPAA says I don't have to sign an authorization to get access to my information. You're actually obligated to provide it to me, and you can require that I request it in writing, but I'm not obligated to sign an authorization for it. So I think that, I'm probably going to reach out to that organization's privacy officer and mention this to them. Next slide, Katie. So with that, we're going to transition into a discussion of the use of the Cobot maturity model to assess your privacy program. So we've been talking so far about ways that you design and structure your program and create a context around it. Now we're going to talk a little bit about why we think the Cobot maturity model might be of benefit to assess your program. So next slide. The Cobot maturity model breaks down processes and/or focus areas. It has 6 levels of maturity from 0 to 5, and it can be used to assess the maturity of your privacy program under that NIST Privacy Framework. We do this when we do our HIPAA security assessments today, and we've been using the cybersecurity framework, the NIST cybersecurity framework, for several years now as part of the process we use to do risk assessments for healthcare organizations. And I think the privacy framework is going to be easy to translate into that for privacy programs. Next slide. So how many people are comfortable or familiar with the Cobot maturity model? And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to see your answers. Apparently, we're having a technical difficulty in my ability to see your responses. But if you wouldn't mind going ahead and putting your responses in either the Q&A or the chat, but yes, no, or somewhat familiar with the Cobot maturity model. And we'll see if we can work with our technical difficulties to see what those responses are. Next slide. So the levels of the NIST maturity model, as you look through this, to me, they're commonsensical. A 0 means that whatever the process is or whatever you're assessing, that particular component doesn't exist. It's just not there. It's not applied at all. So if we think about the cybersecurity framework and the mapping and the elements there, it just doesn't exist. A 1 would be it's sort of the initial phases, or it's somewhat ad hoc, meaning that people may be doing something around it, but it's not organized and it's not consistent. A 2 would be it's repeatable but not intuitive, meaning that there's a regular process that's followed, but maybe it's not clearly documented. Everybody seems to be doing things in a consistent way or can describe them in a consistent way, but there's not good solid documentation around it. A 3 would be a defined process, meaning it's well documented, it's well communicated, and people understand what they need to do. A 4 is that it's not only defined, but it's managed and measured. So there's some key indicators around it, or there's some process to track it and create some metrics around it. And then 5 would be optimized. It follows best practices. It's automated where it can be, things of that nature. Next slide. So if you think about this, the next 2 slides, they come from effective capability and maturity assessment using Cobot, as you can see the reference at the bottom there. And so the first one is just really talking about a process and how you might assess a process, and so what you're looking for in that process. And again, just some examples of a 0, lack of any basic capability. A 1, the process more or less achieves its purpose. 2, the process achieves the purpose through the application of basic yet complete sets of activities. 3, the process achieves the purpose in a much more organized way. So these are the types of things you'd be evaluating and applying that score to that particular element of the process you're evaluating. And I see that it looks like we've got some responses that I think it's to the Cobot one, that we have 9 no's and 1 somewhat. There's another one that's all no's, but I don't know which poll that's in reference to. So if you guys could let me know that, I'd appreciate it. Can you go to the next slide, Katie? So this is just the same example from previously, but this is assessing a focused area. So again, just gives you some sense of what you would be looking for in a particular focused area. So Cobot can be used as an overall model for assessing the maturity, or if you just want to look at a specific element, then you could also use Cobot in that way. And that's really what these 2 slides are trying to communicate. So next slide. So now, as we think about the privacy framework and utilizing the Cobot maturity model, I just took one of the particular categories and subcategories under identify and broke it out into some of the things you might consider looking at to figure out, what score, what maturity would you give that element. So again, remember, this element is identifying and mapping your data, or creating the inventory of your data. And so that 0 would be, there's nothing there, there's no inventory. And I will tell you, there's a fair number of organizations I've encountered that this is the case. They really have no idea what data they hold, where they hold it, how it's held, who holds it, any of that. One might be ad hoc, where there's some inventory, but it's disorganized, it's inconsistent, maybe it's decentralized, so there's no overall organizational inventory. Two might be the inventories exist, but again, there's no consistent process or method for ensuring the inventory is always complete. And so three, the policies and procedures exist for the inventory process, and there's evidence that employees actually understand it and follow it. And then, as I'm not going to read all these, you all can read, but that's, I just wanted to give you an example of, as you think about the privacy framework, it would be breaking down each subcategory to be able to measure that subcategory and what you would be looking for at each level of maturity. And if you do something like this, it's going to be fairly easy for you to then look and see where your gaps are, where you're doing things well. I will tell you, as I mentioned, we use the Cobot maturity model for our risk assessments. And that creates a method. If we've done risk assessments year over year for clients, it creates an easy way for the clients to see how they've progressed and to see where they might still need to do work. But we consider it to be compliant, as you want to interpret that term, if you're at a 3. Can you improve the program and bump it up to a 4? Yes. It's really quite difficult to achieve 5s across the board. We have a few clients that achieve 5s in certain areas, but that's a very, very mature program. And so that also creates an easy way for you to talk about it with your leadership, because you can say to them, we were, whether it's self-assessment or having a third party assess it, you can say we were a 1 last year, we're now a 3. We were a 2 the last time this was assessed, we're now a 4. And so it's an easy way to present the metrics on how your program has evolved and grown and where you might still have some gaps in the program. One of the things that I see is that the awareness of the NIST Privacy Framework was kind of all over the board. It looks like we had a number of yeses, nos, and somewhats. So I hope you find this helpful in our review of this and what we've talked about so far. Can you go to the next slide, Katie? So I think I've already talked about a lot of this, but the benefits of using the maturity model, it's a little less subjective. If you really delineate in advance what you're looking for and how you're going to score it based on what you find for that particular element, then it allows for a little less subjectivity. And if it's well defined as far as what each maturity level would be for a particular element, it also creates more consistency if you've got multiple people doing the assessment. So if Katie did the assessment last year and I did the assessment this year, we would want to see that we're applying those levels consistently. And I think by having a well-defined process where you clearly identify what you're looking for, it creates, minimizes the subjectivity. It's likely that Katie and I, if something should be a 3, we'll both score it a 3. If something should be a 2, we both score it a 2, etc. And again, as I mentioned, it allows for easier identification of sort of where your gaps are, the needed areas of improvement, or where you're doing something well. And it then allows you to focus your resources that, if we've got 3s in these 10 subcategories and we've got 10 more that are 1s, we want to focus our time and energy on bringing the 1s up. We also want to make sure we maintain the 3s, but we're going to spend our resourcing trying to bring the 1s up to 2s or 3s. And again, that consistent measurement over time for that comparison purposes on how your program has maintained effectiveness or has improved on its effectiveness. And it can be used to demonstrate to regulators as well that the organization has made the assessment and also improved the program. So I think there are multiple benefits to thinking about using this model as a way to measure your program. But again, it's going to take some work to set up that construct and to really identify what you're going to look for and what you would be looking for within each component to measure that particular maturity of that component. But it is a way for you to constantly learn and adjust your program. So there is a comment that they use what they call the MEG tool from HGCA group to evaluate their compliance program. New to Cobot, seems like a similar idea to measure year over year. I agree. To me, the preference I would have would be to utilize the Cobot, but perhaps use that in correspondence to the MEG. The MEG to me tells you look for these items that came out of that collaboration with OIG and HCCA as far as the Compliance Effectiveness Resource Guide. But the other thing I think that Cobot would allow you to do is focus in more on what your program does. I find the MEG personally just a bit overwhelming. Not to say it's not a good tool. I think it's set up in a good way. But I think you can also perhaps merge the MEG with the Cobot model to have an even better tool to assess your program. So that's my personal thoughts on it, but others may feel differently. So I'm not sure I understand that, really, the comment is really appreciate this webinar. Setting up a privacy program is our main need. Maybe I can comment on this. I'm not exactly sure what you're asking for comment on. But again, the thinking about your privacy program, I think we are moving to a time in an environment where privacy programs are thinking more holistically about all the data the organization holds. And again, moving away from thinking about this is HIPAA data, this is Gramm-Leach-Bliley data, this is FERPA data, this is name your regulatory obligation data, and thinking about that way. And we've transitioned in security to thinking about security more holistically. And I think we're getting to the point where we're starting to transition to that in privacy. Katie, do you have any thoughts or comments on that?
Yeah, I think too, to the attendee's question, being able to use, it sounds like if you haven't already implemented a privacy program, and probably because you don't have an obligation to do so, being able to use in this privacy framework is that building block to start any sort of state obligations that come along in the future, and potentially even a federal privacy obligation. This is a good place to start. I mean, implementing this tool, you're going to be well on your way to compliance should you have any future regulatory or statutory obligations.
Yeah, I agree with that, Katie. I think you get some flexibility that if you structure your program around specific regulatory obligations, I think you tend not to be as flexible if new obligations come along. And if you look at the state privacy laws, they overlap substantially, but they're not exactly the same. So you're going to have slightly different obligations under one versus the other. And when you think about those state privacy laws, they tend to apply if you have the data of a resident of the state. So if you border a state, or if you're a larger enterprise that may see patients across multiple states, I think about UCLA Health System where I used to work. We had a significant data compromise, and as we looked at the data set, we identified that we had data from at least one person, often more, from all 50 states, as well as I think about 10 or 12 US territories and about 10 or 12 foreign countries. So it's the triggering obligation you may have under state law is not necessarily because you're in that state, but whether you have the data of residents of that state. I don't see that we have any other questions coming through in the chat or Q&A. Katie, any?
Okay. Well, I think we have a couple of questions that you and I can talk through here, and maybe some members of the audience would feel comfortable weighing in as well. And I think we have a couple more minutes, about 2 minutes, a little over 2 minutes here in our presentation. So for our audience, if you could respond either in the questions or the chat, if you have that ability. After hearing Marti and I talk about the NIST Privacy Framework, what are your thoughts on, if you don't already have a privacy program in place, implementing the NIST Privacy Program, the NIST Privacy Framework as a baseline for your program? Marty and I have talked about, doing something like this as a building block to be well on your way to compliance. But I think there's, in the event that there is a future state law or regulatory requirement, but I think there's also an opportunity here for businesses who don't have obligations under law to implement a privacy program, to share with your consumers and the public about your commitment to their privacy of their data.
Well, thanks everyone, and I hope you enjoyed that. And with that, have a great rest of your day.